Human beings have always valued freedom. Entire political systems, revolutions, and philosophies have been built upon the conviction that a person ought to possess the ability to shape his or her own destiny. Yet freedom remains one of the least examined ideas in modern discourse. We speak endlessly of choice, while rarely pausing to consider the conditions under which a choice is made. Consider a simple question. When an individual stands before two doors, can we assume that both lead somewhere worth going? A starving man may choose between hunger and theft. A laborer may accept dangerous work because his family depends upon his income. Decisions are being made in both cases, yet few would describe the circumstances as ideal expressions of human freedom. The available options have already been narrowed by forces beyond the individual's control. This distinction matters because modern societies increasingly treat the existence of a choice as sufficient proof of liberation. The deeper question concerning why certain choices appear attractive in the first place often goes unasked. In recent years, few phenomena have been celebrated under the banner of personal choice more enthusiastically than the rise of digital sex work. Platforms such as OnlyFans are frequently presented as symbols of empowerment, entrepreneurship, and autonomy. Supporters describe a marketplace in which individuals exercise agency over their bodies and profit directly from their labor. Yet economic necessity explains only part of the phenomenon. Many participants enter these platforms under no immediate threat of poverty or homelessness. Some are attracted by the prospect of rapid wealth, others by the promise of fame, independence, flexibility, or social validation. In a culture increasingly impatient with delayed gratification, the temptation of extraordinary rewards can overshadow the slower disciplines through which previous generations built careers, skills, businesses, and reputations. This raises another question: where does necessity end and aspiration begin? At what point does a difficult decision made under pressure become a pursuit motivated by the promise of exceptional rewards? How often are these ambitions shaped by a culture that glorifies visibility, celebrates instant success, and quietly erodes confidence in more traditional paths of advancement? Prostitution is not a modern invention. Human societies have grappled with it for thousands of years. What appears unprecedented is the scale, sophistication, and institutional support with which sexual commodification is now promoted. Never before have billions of dollars been invested into systems capable of encouraging, normalizing, and distributing such practices across the globe. Never before have technological platforms possessed the ability to deliver the same message to millions of people simultaneously. That intimacy can be converted into income, and that self-exposure constitutes a viable path toward personal advancement. Platforms profit whenever individuals decide to place a price upon themselves. Their revenues grow as more participants enter the marketplace, and as existing participants increase their level of engagement. The corporation's interests are therefore aligned with expansion. Growth requires more creators, more content, more exposure, and more participation. The risks, however, are distributed very differently. The platform risks little beyond ordinary business concerns. The individual assumes the reputational risk, the relational risk, the psychological risk, and the uncertainty of how these choices may shape future opportunities. If the venture succeeds, the platform profits. If it fails, the platform profits. If the participant later regrets the decision, the platform retains its earnings all the same. Nearly all of the skin in the game belongs to the creator. Such an arrangement raises uncomfortable questions. Can a system be described as empowering when those who design it bear almost none of the consequences, while those who participate bear almost all of them? Can freedom be measured solely by the ability to enter a marketplace, while ignoring the forces that incentivize participation and the costs that accompany it? These questions extend far beyond any single website. They touch upon the relationship between freedom and necessity, between dignity and profit, and between the individual and the culture that shapes his perception of what is possible. The purpose of this essay is not to condemn individuals. Rather, it is to examine a broader phenomenon, The growing tendency of modern societies to mistake market participation for empowerment and commodification for freedom. OnlyFans serves as a useful case study because it reveals, with unusual clarity, a deeper pattern within contemporary culture. And to understand that pattern, we must begin with the idea that gives it legitimacy: choice. Any discussion of digital sex work eventually arrives at an uncomfortable fact: no marketplace exists without customers. Much of the public conversation focuses upon the women who create content. Far less attention is devoted to the men whose participation finances the entire ecosystem. Yet every subscription, every purchase, and every recurring payment contributes to the continued expansion of the same industry. The obvious explanation is straightforward enough. Men are paying for access to photographs, videos, messages, and interactions. The persistence and scale of the phenomenon, however, suggests that something deeper is taking place. Human beings possess needs that extend beyond physical desire. They seek companionship, recognition, affection, admiration, intimacy, and the sense of belonging. Throughout most of history, these needs were pursued through relationships, families, communities, friendships, religious institutions, and shared responsibilities. None of these paths guaranteed success, but all required a degree of patience, vulnerability, and mutual commitment. The digital marketplace offers an alternative. For a monthly subscription, a customer may gain access to a carefully curated experience designed to simulate aspects of intimacy while avoiding many of the difficulties associated with real human relationships. Attention can be purchased. Validation can be purchased. The appearance of personal connection can be purchased. The transaction may provide temporary relief from loneliness, but relief and resolution are not necessarily the same thing. This distinction becomes important because the platform's incentives differ from those of the customer. A man who overcomes his isolation, develops meaningful relationships, and builds a fulfilling social life becomes less dependent upon the service being offered. A man who returns repeatedly in search of the same emotional reassurance generates recurring revenue. The platform therefore occupies an unusual position within the exchange. It profits from a condition that it possesses little incentive to solve. The same observation applies to the creators whose content sustains the marketplace. Their visibility attracts customers. The customers provide revenue. The platform collects a percentage from every transaction. The arrangement appears at first glance to benefit all parties involved, yet a closer examination reveals that the corporation bears remarkably little of the risk. The creator assumes the reputational risk. The customer assumes the financial cost. Both may invest substantial portions of their time, attention, emotional energy, and future opportunities. The platform, meanwhile, prospers so long as participation continues. On one side stands the desire to be desired. On the other stands the desire to feel desired. Between them stands an institution that has learned how to monetize both. For this reason, the responsibility of men extends beyond the question of personal consumption. Their choices help determine which industries grow, which incentives are rewarded, and which visions of human relationships become culturally dominant. Every market, regardless of its product, ultimately reflects the values of those who sustain it. The question facing men is therefore larger than whether they should subscribe to a particular creator. It concerns the kind of culture they wish to help build and the kind of men they wish to become. Every society understands debt. An individual accepts something of value in the present while committing a portion of the future to repayment. The arrangement frequently appears sensible at the outset, particularly when the immediate benefit is tangible and the eventual cost remains distant or uncertain. For many women, participation in platforms such as OnlyFans follows a comparable logic. The appeal is not difficult to understand. Stories of extraordinary earnings circulate widely across social media, news outlets, and online communities. Financial independence, flexible working conditions, and the possibility of transforming attention into income are presented as attainable outcomes. The exceptional success stories naturally attract the greatest visibility, while the experiences of those who earn little or eventually abandon the platform receive considerably less attention. Part of the attraction stems from a tendency that extends far beyond digital sex work. Human beings are remarkably poor at evaluating probabilities when exceptional outcomes are placed before them. The winner of a lottery receives more attention than the millions who purchased tickets and received nothing. A successful actor becomes more visible than the thousands who never secure a meaningful role. Social media magnifies this tendency by continuously placing extraordinary cases at the center of public attention. OnlyFans appears particularly dependent upon this dynamic. A small number of creators achieve substantial financial success and become highly visible examples of what the platform makes possible. Their stories circulate widely, often accompanied by images of wealth, independence, and personal freedom. The far larger population of participants who earn modest sums, struggle to attract subscribers, or eventually leave the platform rarely occupy the same space in the public imagination. As a result, many individuals evaluate the opportunity through the lens of possibility rather than probability. What often remains absent from these discussions is a broader accounting of costs. Financial returns can be measured with precision. Questions of privacy, reputation, future opportunities, and self-perception resist the same form of calculation, despite playing a significant role in shaping the course of a person's life. Their value becomes most apparent when they are diminished or lost. A decision made at 22 may appear entirely practical within the circumstances that produced it. Years later, those circumstances may have changed beyond recognition. Professional ambitions develop, personal relationships deepen, and priorities that once seemed distant begin to occupy a central place in life. The digital record, however, remains largely indifferent to these transformations. Material created for one chapter of life often survives well into the next, carrying consequences that were neither anticipated nor intended. The issue extends further than reputation alone. Most professions maintain a degree of separation between the worker and the work itself. A carpenter is ultimately judged by the quality of the furniture he produces. An architect is evaluated through the structures she designs. Even artists, whose work is often deeply personal, create objects that possess an existence independent of their creators. Digital sex work narrows that distinction considerably. The individual increasingly becomes inseparable from the product being sold. Physical appearance, personality, private experiences, and intimate aspects of identity acquire direct commercial value. Over time, this arrangement can encourage a habit of self-evaluation that relies heavily upon the reactions of an audience, particularly when those reactions are linked to financial reward. The long-term effects of such an environment are difficult to quantify, yet difficulty of measurement should not be confused with absence of consequence. Human beings adapt remarkably well to the conditions in which they spend their time. Habits of thought formed over months or years rarely disappear the moment a platform is abandoned, and ways of viewing oneself that were once useful for commercial success can persist long after they cease to serve any meaningful purpose. For this reason, the language of debt remains useful. The transaction offers benefits that are immediate, visible, and easily understood. The costs emerge on a different timetable, often revealing themselves through future circumstances that cannot be predicted in advance. Privacy, reputation, self-respect, and the freedom to leave the past behind possess a value that rarely becomes evident until they are placed at risk. Wise decisions require a full accounting of both sides of the ledger, including those assets whose worth cannot be expressed in dollars. Imagine a young woman standing before a decision that appears capable of solving several immediate problems. Perhaps she is struggling financially. Perhaps she feels overlooked and invisible. Perhaps she has watched others achieve a level of income, attention, or independence that seems increasingly difficult to attain through conventional means. The details vary from person to person, but the underlying situation is familiar. A difficult present accompanied by the promise of a seemingly attractive shortcut. Human beings naturally evaluate opportunities through the lens of their current circumstances. The pressures of the present possess a weight and urgency that future consequences rarely match. Rent must be paid, debts accumulate, ambitions remain unfulfilled, frustrations demand relief. Under such conditions, the future can easily appear distant, while the immediate opportunity appears concrete and attainable. Yet the quality of a decision cannot be measured solely by its ability to resolve a present difficulty. A choice that appears advantageous over the course of a month may reveal a different character when viewed across a decade. The central question, therefore, concerns more than whether a particular opportunity provides a solution. It concerns the kind of future that opportunity makes more likely. This principle extends well beyond platforms such as OnlyFans. Every major decision involves an exchange. Certain paths expand future possibilities, while others quietly restrict them. Some strengthen relationships, reputations, and personal development. Others introduce risks whose significance becomes apparent only after years have passed. The challenge facing young people today is made more difficult by the sheer number of voices competing for their attention. Social media platforms, influencers, advertisers, online communities, and commercial enterprises all possess interests of their own. Their advice frequently reflects those interests. The person receiving that advice often assumes the greatest share of the risk while possessing the least amount of experience with its potential consequences. For this reason, moments of uncertainty require a degree of intellectual independence. Before accepting the promises attached to any path, it is worth examining who benefits when those promises are believed. Before accepting claims about empowerment, freedom, or success, it is worth studying the experiences of those who have already traveled the road. Before making a decision that may shape years of one's life, it is worth considering whether the most enthusiastic advocates of that decision will still be present to help carry its consequences. The purpose of such reflection is neither fear nor hesitation. Every meaningful life requires risk, and every worthwhile ambition involves uncertainty. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between risks that contribute to growth and risks that expose valuable things to unnecessary danger. At the center of this difficulty lies a relationship that receives remarkably little attention: the relationship between the present self and the future self. The future version of oneself possesses no voice in present deliberations. She cannot argue her case. She cannot explain what she values, whom she loves, or what opportunities she may one day wish she had preserved. She depends entirely upon the judgment of the person making decisions today. Human beings often speak as though a life belongs to a single, unchanging individual moving steadily through time. Experience suggests a more complicated reality. The person who exists at 20 is rarely identical to the person who exists at 35, and both may seem unfamiliar to the person who eventually reaches 60. Values evolve. New responsibilities emerge. Relationships form that could not have been imagined years earlier. Entire worlds of meaning appear where previously there was only uncertainty. A fuller exploration of this subject lies beyond the scope of the present essay and deserves its own treatment. For the purposes of this discussion, however, it is sufficient to recognize that every major decision constitutes a form of communication between these successive versions of ourselves. The present self possesses the authority to act, while the future self inherits the consequences. Many of the most important choices we make are therefore not made solely for ourselves, but also for the strangers we will eventually become. The same assets discussed previously, reputation, privacy, and future flexibility, often become the very things that make departure more difficult than entry. One of the most frequently repeated arguments in defense of platforms such as OnlyFans is that participation remains voluntary. No one is physically compelled to create an account. No one is forced to upload content. No one is prevented from leaving. At a strictly technical level, this observation is correct. Yet the absence of physical coercion does not exhaust the question of freedom. Human beings rarely become trapped by chains. More often, they become trapped by consequences. Every significant decision alters the landscape of future possibilities. A student who abandons her education, an entrepreneur who invests his savings in a failing venture, or an individual who acquires a damaging reputation may discover that options once available have become considerably more difficult to access. The original decision remains voluntary. The resulting constraints are no less real. A young woman may enter the platform believing she is making a temporary calculation. The intention may be to earn additional income, resolve a financial difficulty, or take advantage of an opportunity that appears attractive at the time. In many cases, the expectation is that participation will remain limited in duration and easily reversible. Reality often proves more complicated. Content created for a short-term purpose can persist indefinitely. Material may be copied, archived, redistributed, or detached from its original context. Employers, colleagues, family members, and future partners occupy a world in which information is increasingly searchable and difficult to erase. The decision to leave a platform, therefore, does not necessarily restore the conditions that existed before joining it. Economic incentives can further reinforce the situation. A participant who begins earning meaningful income through digital sex work may discover that alternative sources of income require substantial reductions in earnings. Skills developed within one marketplace do not always transfer easily into another. What initially appeared to be a temporary strategy can gradually assume the characteristics of a long-term dependency, particularly when financial obligations begin adjusting themselves to a higher level of income. The platform itself bears little responsibility for these outcomes. Its revenue is generated through participation rather than permanence. Whether a creator remains for 6 months or 6 years, whether she ultimately views the experience as beneficial or regrettable, the underlying business model continues functioning in largely the same manner. The participant assumes the burden of navigating reputational consequences, future career considerations, changing personal circumstances, and evolving priorities. The platform assumes none of these responsibilities, despite having benefited from the transaction at every stage. For this reason, the language of entrapment should be understood carefully. The claim is not that individuals are physically unable to leave. Many do leave. Others remain by choice. The more interesting question concerns the difference between leaving a platform and returning to the position one occupied before entering it. These are not necessarily the same thing. A decision may be voluntary at the moment it is made, while simultaneously creating conditions that narrow future options. Such outcomes are neither unique to OnlyFans nor exclusive to digital sex work. They appear throughout human life, wherever short-term incentives obscure long-term consequences. The invisible shackles, therefore, are not found in the inability to walk away. They are found in the realization that walking away does not always restore what was surrendered in exchange for entry. Every system of entrapment possesses two dimensions. The first consists of external pressures, financial incentives, social expectations, institutional interests, and the practical realities that encourage individuals to remain on a particular path. These forces are relatively easy to identify because they originate outside the self. The second dimension is often more difficult to recognize. Human beings create explanations for their choices, assemble narratives around their experiences, and gradually weave those narratives into their identities. Over time, the distinction between defending a decision and defending oneself can become surprisingly difficult to maintain. This tendency appears throughout human life. An investor may continue funding a failing venture because abandoning it would require acknowledging years of misplaced confidence. A political partisan may ignore evidence that challenges deeply held beliefs because changing course would threaten an entire worldview. A person trapped in an unhealthy relationship may spend years rationalizing circumstances that would appear unacceptable to an outside observer. The underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. The greater the personal investment, the more difficult it becomes to evaluate the situation with genuine detachment. For this reason, the most significant barrier to leaving any destructive system often originates within the individual rather than around her. Remember that the obstacle is not ignorance. Information is usually available. Warnings are often available as well. Friends, family members, former participants, and even personal experience may all point toward the same conclusion. What frequently prevents change is the emotional burden associated with reconsidering a choice that has already become part of one's identity. A person who has publicly defended a decision for years may find it easier to continue defending it than to revisit the assumptions upon which it was built. The prospect of admitting error can feel more painful than the consequences of persisting in it. So my point here is that this reality cannot be ignored because modern digital culture rewards certainty while discouraging reflection. Social media platforms encourage public declarations, immediate judgments, and unwavering confidence. Doubt receives little applause. Reconsideration is often mistaken for weakness. The result is an environment in which changing one's mind becomes unnecessarily difficult, yet intellectual honesty requires precisely that possibility. Growth depends upon the ability to revisit previous conclusions and subject them to fresh examination. No person arrives at adulthood possessing perfect knowledge. Every life contains mistaken assumptions, failed judgments, misplaced trust, and lessons learned through experience. The capacity to revise one's understanding in light of new evidence represents one of the healthiest qualities a human being can cultivate. The first step in escaping any harmful situation therefore begins with a willingness to question the story one has been telling oneself. This process requires neither self-condemnation nor humiliation. It requires only enough courage to ask whether a different interpretation of events may be closer to the truth than the one currently being defended. Such moments are rarely comfortable. They demand humility. They demand honesty. They occasionally demand the abandonment of beliefs that once felt indispensable. Yet they also create the possibility of genuine freedom, because a person cannot change direction while remaining emotionally committed to every decision made in the past. For this reason, the first escape is often an internal one. Before circumstances change, before habits change, before environments change, a person must first recover the ability to examine her own assumptions without fear. Only then can she begin deciding whether the path she is walking still leads where she hopes to go.